Let's get started. Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Arden, and today we're reviewing Marvel Voices #1. So, basically, because I got really bummed out by the lockdown and stuff happening in my area, the longest lockdown in North America due to our province and its mismanagement. So, it's been a while since we just reviewed a straight comic book. So I grabbed the top one off of my pile and decided it was time to talk about it. And it's one that I've been looking forward to because I ordered this after we reviewed the last Marvel Voices type of issue, one that focused entirely on indigenous populations. This one is way more broad than that and seems to be kind of the start of a new series potentially, or even just a single special. I couldn't really tell and didn't really care to look it up because either way, it's just a fun sort of comic created out of this podcast that they were talking about. And this book, unlike the indigenous one, kind of talks about how it was created, why it came to be, and why they're doing it. And it's quite interesting. It's a very different kind of comic book because right away we get this like roadmap through it basically that just goes on for like 4 pages, and some of it is within the context of this book, and other stuff is available online in these essays and stuff. And to be honest, out of what we're talking about, some of the essays are the most interesting things. The anthology book itself is a wide array of talent and different comic book stories, most of them pretty short in length. Some as short as a single page long, while others are much more fleshed out and fun, dare I say, compared to the single page ones, which are kind of just nothing and I didn't really get a lot out of. I've talked about this on other anthology books before, where sometimes cramming in too many stories like that dilutes the overall quality of each individual story to the extent that I don't feel I love it as much as I would if there were less stories more fleshed out. And that feels especially true in an anthology book that's partially online already, where you could just be putting more stuff up online and expanding stories. Raphael says, "Hey, Arden, woke up late, so no work today." Well, I hope you have a job where that's cool. That would be bad news in my work situation, but, well, I don't know. There is a plan for stuff like that, but because I work in healthcare, yeah. Ideally, you can't just not show up. That really screws over the person from before and kind of your employers to a degree, but like they should have backups in play, but that's just not possible in pandemic times at the moment. So we can't have an army of backup workers ready to go for various reasons. So anyways, but thank you for joining us. It's great to have you, Raphael. I have today off, so that's why we're reviewing this now, but also it's a time when people are online apparently due to time zones and stuff like that. Things do shift around, and I try to make these streams as available to as many people as possible. Now, anyways, so we're just going to kind of go through what's mostly in the comic, but no, there are other online things, and whether or not Raphael says I'm an independent contractor. Well, there you go. So that does allow for a lot of flexibility, and technically I'm a contractor for Comic Island, and I do enjoy the flexibility that comes with that and the freedom to kind of pick and choose my hours and that sort of thing. So good for you. Hopefully you're doing okay in these times, but a lot of contractors actually are because people are doing home improvement stuff and that sort of thing and making those upgrades. Anyways, Lift Every Voice by John Jennings is like the opening essay, and I actually liked this one quite a bit. John Jennings is like an Eisner Award-winning artist and scholar, and he's did the artwork on Octavia Butler's Kindred. He's also a professor of media and cultural studies at the University of California, Riverside, and is the curator of Abrams Megascope and founder. So he's a really interesting guy, and he talks a lot. It's a very interesting essay because, for better or worse, it is very pro-Marvel, but in a very, not even defensive way. It's celebrating what Marvel has done well with diversity, and he talks a lot about how Marvel had the first black superhero, and over time, they've come to really represent people with disabilities through stuff like Daredevil or Echo, LGBTQ characters like Iceman and Northstar. He talks about how the comics, through stuff like the X-Men, have long been used to confront social issues, and it's a very interesting essay. I found it just fascinating, and he talks about how Marvel has been able to push these boundaries historically. And what I found most interesting about it is he does all of this, like Jennings writes this whole essay without really mentioning Stan Lee. And I actually like that. While Stan Lee is kind of heavily implied in these books and is clearly a big factor in this, he wasn't the only one pushing for diversity along the way in the company's history. And I feel as though Jennings is kind of allowing for space for more people to sort of take credit as they should, because you have people out there like historically like Roger Stern and stuff like that who are also big in the history of making Marvel a more open space, and then more modern voices that are pushing the boundaries even further. And that's kind of what this book is about. And like I said, the essays are kind of the more interesting thing out of this whole book anthology because of it, because they talk about this stuff, and it's very interesting hearing that perspective. Tevye Smoka says hello, thanks for joining. And yeah, I think most people would enjoy this so long as you aren't like defensive about it, because it's really not talking about it in a way that excludes people like me or anything like that. And it's cool that we get to showcase new creators and people who aren't just Jason, Aaron, Bendis, and those types of writers over and over again. I love a lot of those writers. Like, I like Alan Hickman and stuff like that. But when we over-rely on the writers, it does get repetitive. And Bendis seems like a prime example of both Marvel and DC relying on this talent when there's all these cool people out there who should have more of a chance to write comics, regardless of their background or where they're from. Like, the comic book world is very bottlenecked in that regard, and this book is a cool thesis on like what kind of cool artists or writers are out there. Tevye says Scott Lobdell as another example of a writer who gets overused. That's a good one. I mean, that's less so these days, but that's a good example of like he had 3 New 52 series when there's so many cool comic book writers that could have made a name for themselves during the New 52. And that is, yes, that is tied to the voices being represented in this book, the minorities of the world, people with disabilities, people of color, LGBTQ, etc. These people deserve a chance too, but that's also just true of everyone. Anyone who isn't Bendis and Lobdell and all these people are often precluded from a chance to really have an opportunity as a writer or artist, even with these big 2 companies. And books like these I'm always happy to see, regardless of like what the ethos is behind it. So that's why I was like I feel as though most people can just appreciate this book for what it is. Raphael says, I think when they try new things, we get new and different stories. Exactly. That's where I get more excited about it too, because when you rely on people like Bendis or Jeff Johns to tell the same crossover events, that's a big reason why a lot of them feel the same. Raphael continues with saying, it may or may not be a good story, but at least they tried. And I second that motion too. And I think if you look across by reviews historically on Comic Island, you'll notice that I'm a lot more charitable to stuff that was experimental and it didn't work out, to stuff that was trying the same thing over and over again, and it's just like mediocre and boring because of it. Tevye says, yeah, the comic book world is super bottled, and that's just sad and depressing. Yeah, and I think that like while I do think it is tied to the larger issues of like systemic racism and like other forms of discrimination in the U.S., like I said, it's also just a power dynamic, and people who are cisgender and white and Christian and like fall into like just the complete majority of the US are still harmed by this system because they are also kept out of it when they aren't in the in-group. And that's where books like this are very important. And I tend to really, I've been interested in and I've been really enjoying how Marvel and DC have been putting out these like premium books that are showcasing this kind of talent, using these kind of characters, and kind of stepping forward in the right direction, in my opinion. Anyways, so the next story after that is a single page one with Brother Voodoo, who we've been talking a lot about on Comic Island. But honestly, this story was just like a very insignificant, the first of our single page things where he's just fighting a demon, battling some Roxxon guys, and just making a little bit of narration. There isn't really anything to it. So it's written by Evan Narcisse, art by Janoy Lindsay, and colored by Emilio Lopez, but this book really isn't going to tell you a lot about them from a single page. The next story, though, is like 4 pages long, which is short still, but even something like that is more fleshed out. And it's actually a really fun race being held by Stark Industries or something like that, and the 2 teams we're focusing on is the Wakanda team and the Krakoan team, which I think is fun as hell. So it's really just this story focusing on Forge and Shuri having this race with one another across all these crazy landscapes, going through portals, all these different obstacle courses. At one point they have to like navigate around this actively erupting volcano, which is, so it's a really fun little race. And then it ends with the 2 of them not winning, and another team wins because they're so focused on competing with each other. But they shake hands, and it has a nice little fun ending. It's honestly one of my favorite stories in this whole thing because it's nice and simple and fun. And that, written by, let's see here, Ayala and Chang and Maiolo is how they're credited. I think somewhere else it does have a more specific breakdown of who does what. Yeah, Vida Ayala wrote it, Bernard Chang did the artwork, and Marcelo Maiolo did the coloring. This gave me a better idea of what kind of creative team these 3 creators are, and the art's fun and dynamic, while the writing is just this nice and breezy story. Plus, it's between Forge and Shuri, which is just a really fun combination of characters. These 2 really smart characters that, because of the way Marvel is set up in the world that's been established, because you have these international competitions, Wakanda and Krakoa would have their own teams, and it becomes this fun little rivalry. It's a very friendly, happy story, and like I said, it kind of stands out. The next one's really interesting. It's only 2 pages, done entirely by Brian Stelfreeze. A very simple, but a little more elegant story where Black Widow is just basically fighting this gang of goons while protecting a little girl. And it's a fun, effective little piece. This is actually one of the 2 pages right there, and I really like the very pastel style coloring with soft outlining, so barely even feels inked at all. It looks good and works well for a character like Black Widow, and kind of shows how we're just really focusing, like it doesn't have to just be all these characters of color and stuff in this story. At one point we do have a story about Wolverine and Hulk, for example, so a lot of it is about who's working on the stuff behind the scenes too. Then there's a story with Emma Frost. It's a single pager, but does have some fun nods to her history, but again kind of feels insignificant because of that. Then there's a page by Lucanio Vecchio that's just a fun little celebration of all their LGBTQ characters. And I actually didn't hate that because that felt more like just this little homage thing. That sort of thing works because there's no real story there. It's just like a little display of artwork, basically. And that worked for me. A fun showcase of different characters and the changing landscape of Marvel, while also having a little bit of acknowledgement of like the history of this movement and stuff. Tevye says, I also think the big 2 really needs to let their characters grow up and mature and needs them to get married and grow old. Well, that's an interesting debate, and you have stuff like Savage Dragon that does kind of go in that direction of there being consequences, things being built up, and the story doesn't hold itself in place ever. I have mixed feelings on it. You get stuff like DC where they do these reboots, and it kind of allows for characters to be reworked, but also for these characters to grow over time because you can change them. But then they also have stuff like Rebirth, where Superman does grow and get a family, and it really is much more interesting and better than what exists before. So it's an interesting idea. I think part of where these new characters like Miles Morales are able to find a light out of the shadows and stuff like that is because they are able to develop and stuff while their characters have remained stagnant, which does kind of get into what Tevye is saying about a need to maybe let those characters grow up in an effort for these new characters to grow in. In some ways, though, I also feel like the MCU is kind of forcing Marvel's hand in that regard because they don't seem super rushed to recast Iron Man or Captain America anytime soon, but rather let these characters kind of progress forward and let a new Captain America emerge and that sort of thing, which might be a better model for Marvel storytelling going forward over the sliding time scale as it currently exists, because you have a character like Spider-Man, the Peter Parker Spider-Man, and he does feel like he's stalled out quite a bit. Tevi says, I'm fine with LGBT characters if it isn't forced down your throat 24/7. I'm not saying it's bad for these characters to exist. I'm all for them existing because if it makes sense. Well, you know, like one could say that about straight characters though, and it often feels like the argument just becomes asinine when you flip that. So, you know, it doesn't really feel forced to have a page dedication in that for a book of diversity, for example. Raphael says, the only thing about this, it seems like an event thing, but for it to just be for normal people. It should just happen naturally with no need for it to be mentioned. Don't mean this in a negative way. I'm actually with you with that for Raphael. Same thing with DC doing like the other history of the DC universe on their Black Label books. I do like those stories and they're a good first step, but I do feel the challenges from here. Okay, we have all these cool people, legends from the past who are returning to write some of these essays. New talent that's never had a chance to do anything for Marvel, getting that chance, and ones that are kind of active in the company as well. So that's a nice mix of stuff. But how do we incorporate like some of this new talent into actual stories? How do we better integrate these characters into actual stories? I think that's even what Tevye was kind of getting at, because he's agreeing in chat too. And I'm with you guys for that. I do think these special books are a bit of a double-edged sword, and I could see a person belonging to one of these communities, and you know, I do belong to a couple of them, but I like a person of color, for example, arguing exactly what Raphael is saying right now, that it shouldn't be treated as this special thing. This should just be part of Avengers storytelling and Spider-Man storytelling and all the other stuff, which is increasingly true of Marvel, to be fair. It does. I don't necessarily need or want this to be this ongoing endless series, because I do kind of think we need to be careful about that and how it's done. I don't mind if it's occasionally done as like this a special thing, but Raphael's right, that has to be done carefully. So for example, they have done other issues where like it focuses on one community and stuff like that, and you have stuff like where that can be a good thesis statement, but I would say maybe those books should also be a jumping off point for a new series or something like that, and for something more ongoing and permanent within the existing Marvel infrastructure. It's a really good point Raphael made, and it was kind of in the back of my mind while talking about this in the review, so I'm glad we could touch on that a little bit. Next is actually one of my favorite essays across the whole thing we're talking about today. Actually, not. It is my favorite essay. It's by David Betancourt, and it's about Miles Morales. He's a comic book culture reporter at the Washington Post, but I don't know. This gets into how brilliantly this book is edited, because someone knew this guy had this experience with Spider-Man and he wrote about it, and it very much reflects my experience with Spider-Man. Betancourt got into the comic book world more before me, and he got into like 90s Spider-Man books, which I didn't do. But once it came out in the early 2000s and he was studying in university, kind of around the same time I was, he was clued into Ultimate Spider-Man, and he talks a lot about how Mark Bagley really won him over with his artwork for Spider-Man, and how devastated he was when the Ultimate Peter Parker died. And then he was really skeptical about Miles Morales, even though Betancourt has a Puerto Rican dad and a black mother, meaning that he is a very similar person to Miles, just with his parents flipped. And he later would encounter Bendis, and Bendis would be like, oh damn, you are Miles Morales. Over time, Betancourt fell in love with this character and talked about how cool it is to him that someone like him is Spider-Man, and just like so fundamentally encapsulates that role now, and has his own movie and video game and stuff. And it's really cool to hear that perspective, and even just to think about how new Miles is and how much of a hold he's taken on the comic book world, which I thought was really interesting. And then again, getting into how well edited this book is, that's immediately followed up by a Spider-Man story, but not a Miles Morales story. It's actually about the spider that bit Peter Parker and Silk, and how it like grew to become intelligent and more like larger than the average spider of its own species. It's like 100 times bigger or something like that. The scientist taught it to speak and like the English language, and it learned a sense of justice from Spider-Man and Silk, basically watching them over the years. And it started to do it on its own, where it would capture bad guys, but being a spider, it would like devour them and stuff. And it's like, yeah, that's an unfortunate side of my nature, but I at least try and go after only bad people. And like, I'm not going to call myself a superhero or anything like that, but I am at least inspired by them to be more than what I am, which is just a spider. And it's so interesting. And that gets into what Raphael was saying earlier, actually, about how these new writers, new creators, and all these people have new ideas and really cool stuff they can bring forward, including like just this wacky idea about this radioactive spider growing up to become something very different from what we know. It's one of those things where it kind of works as its own little side story, but you never know when some enterprising Spider-Man writer might be like, this is a really fun idea, I'm going to make more out of it one day or something like that. And it would be cool. James Moore Englehart wrote it. Ray Anthony Height is the artist, and Emilio Lopez is the colorist again. And that is where it is a well-edited book too. Like, you do get a chance to see that colorist in action a little bit more, and he is a good colorist. This story within the book, I should say, is well drawn, and you have like really cool colors used throughout it. So, by shuffling around the talent a little bit, we do get an idea of stuff like that. Then there's a single page with Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur. This does feature coloring by one of my favorite colorists out there, Tenera Bonvillain, I should say. It's a fun little story, but it is just one of those one-page things, and it's just kind of very disposable because of that. It doesn't have a lot to it. Next one is Tatya King Jones, an essay by her, I should say, called Applied Science. And it's a really interesting short essay where she kind of and she's like this writer and podcaster, all this stuff, who relates technology and science to fiction and just talks about that stuff in general. And in this story, she really focuses on how real science from actual black women is used to inform all sorts of stuff in Marvel history. She talks about how like Teragenesis and some of that technology was similar to they created the system created to detect like Terrigen clouds and mists and stuff is kind of based on the like home security system developed by a black woman who just didn't have protection in a community. She talks about how like a black woman and her work is instrumental in creating 3D printing, which is a huge element of a lot of modern Marvel stories and that sort of thing. It's just an interesting way of showing like how different communities have contributed to science, even though people tend to downplay it, and how easily it is to relate that stuff to like just science fiction and storytelling and even just everyday life in our world around us. There's way more examples of that, and I kind of found it interesting. She really only focused on like 2, but it is a short essay, so I think that's why. Next is a really interesting drawn one-pager by Kyle Baker. It's just got a lot of... I love the more painted look of stories like that, and it was just focusing on Nick Fury being pranked by Ant-Man. It has some fun with the idea of perspective, and because Nick Fury doesn't have depth perception, he has trouble properly seeing it, but that's about it. And then there's a story about like an inhuman character doing things, but I honestly feel like I needed to have read something else to know what they were referring to there. So that's what I meant. Like, a lot of one pages are just like, okay, whatever, and you just kind of keep on going. There's a 2-page story called What a Wonderful World, but Wonderful is crossed out, and it focuses on Silver Surfer looking over a dead Earth. It's written by Rob Markman, art by Damon Scott, and coloring by Dono Sanchez Almara. And this one was really disappointing, actually, because it has a lot of cool imagery and the Silver Surfer talking about his history with the Earth and stuff. But then he just says, oh, my deepest regret is that we could not save mankind from itself. And it's a very basic, just kind of environmental message. And I was like, okay. So we have another kind of disposable story. And like I said, what I get more from this is the actual essays and the longer stories, and that stuff really I took way more away from than the single pager and 2 pager stuff, which felt a lot more questionable. But then we do have a story called Death by Method Man and Danielle Dominguez, art by Aletha E. Martinez, and coloring by Emilio Lopez, who is clearly like a huge part of this book and the coloring he does. And the cool thing about this is a very differently colored book, but well-made one too. And Wolverine kind of comes across this village of dead people. He learns what happened and witnesses Death herself, like, reap the soul that was responsible for the village being wiped out. Logan, and this is a flashback story very clearly, and he still has his bone claws and stuff, begs for Death, but she just abandons him without saving or saying a word, and he just reflects on that for a minute. I just find it really funny. They have people like Method Man contributing to this book, though, and that's a lot of fun. Christmas Blues is a similar kind of thing, where Charlemagne the God and Chris Miles are the writers, and J.G. Kirby's the artist. This book felt a little more self-indulgent because Charlemagne shows up himself to talk to Blue Marvel for a little bit, and Blue Marvel leaves some Christmas gifts at the door of a family, and that's about it. So there isn't really a lot of stuff there. Yes, I do assume these are referring to the artists that like the rapper artists and stuff. Tevi was saying that they were just asking in chat. Tevi was saying it's a shame Miles Morales Spider-Man doesn't get a chance to shine in the main Marvel universe. And personally, call me crazy and call me insane, but I would love to have Peter Parker retire. Well, that's interesting because it could do that. I feel like Miles does kind of have his own little corner of the Marvel universe, like in the worlds of comics, carved out at this point. But I don't know about Peter Parker retiring, but I definitely think they should find ways to kind of grow out that character a little bit so he can fill a different role than Miles, who is the young, up-and-coming Spider-Man, who is the underdog and stuff now. Peter should be a more experienced, established superhero at this point, and I think they still shy away from that, even in like Nick Spencer's stuff these days. Although I haven't read one of those in a long time either. Tevi says that Miles Morales Spider-Man be the main Spider-Man in the main Marvel universe while Peter gets to retire and live with his wife Mary Jane and have a kid, Mayday Parker, while Miles Morales stays. Okay, so you got a whole little plan there. That's interesting. Next up is She-Hulk in Punishment, a story by Roxane Gay, art by Brittanyl Williams, and coloring by Rochelle.
I'm not sure about that.
Hey, I wasn't talking to you. And she must have misheard me there. And coloring by Rochelle Rosenberg. It's a pretty... Actually, I don't like this story because basically it involves She-Hulk feeling really bad about this guy getting like punishment, and then basically like ripping him from a police car, just letting this victim like get a few minutes alone with the perpetrator. And I understand I understand the need to do that, or like the catharsis in it, but there's a reason we don't let like murder victims be at the mercy of the family of the victim. Like that leads to frontier justice and stuff like that. So I was like, oh, for a single page story that just had a little bit of a rough implication to it that maybe we shouldn't dig into too much. The next essay is really interesting, and it's by Don McGregor, and it's about him and his experience with creating Killmonger side by side with Rich Buckler and Billy Graham. He talks a lot about the experience, what went into designing his costume, but also, and this part was really interesting, the resistance they faced in making this character and putting in the time until ultimately it led to them like drawing this moment right here that was used in the Black Panther film, and how much of a fight that was in 1973 when they did this. It really gets into what that Jennings guy was saying at the beginning of this book about how Marvel, and it isn't just Stan Lee, has been about this struggle and been about pushing these boundaries even within their own company. And it's very fascinating how this stuff ultimately was heavy fodder for what was put in the Black Panther film to great effect. It's really cool to kind of look into that and just see how, even though Marvel did go out of their way to make the first black superhero, even then it was a struggle for like a decade after. And Don McGregor talks a lot about the challenges in writing a Black Panther story when he wasn't the most popular character in the world, and there was a lot pushing back against it at the time. Like I said, the essays really are what stand out in this book, which some people tend to dislike in a comic, but personally I enjoy quite a bit. The last story is also an excellent story, in part because it's longer. It's called Back to Madripoor. It's written by David F. Walker and Chuck Brown. Sanford Green is the artist, and Matt Hearns is the colorist. Not only does it look amazing and kind of feel like a bit of a throwback, you've actually seen one of those pages flashing by throughout this review with Wolverine looking all angry. It's a fun example of Logan putting on like his like eye patch and suit outfit that I've seen before, and like fighting a bunch of people because the Madripoor gate has been sealed from Krakoa. He goes and finds out that Hulk, in his gray form, also wearing a tuxedo, is apparently hanging out there and smashing anyone that's shown up, because here in Madripoor everyone's a criminal, so at least the Hulk can take out his anger on the larger community without anyone getting hurt. So he says very clearly, like, I'm not leaving this gate, you guys are just going to have to deal with that. And even when the Hulk calms down and Banner comes out and tries to like basically talk Logan down and says like, no, like the Hulk's safer here because he's not hurting anyone who like doesn't already kind of have it coming. And Logan just kind of shrugs, stabs Banner, and drags his corpse away, knowing, you know, Banner will be fine, but at least he can get him out of Madripoor while he's out. And I really liked that story. It was a fun little thing. And then the last essay is actually the most boring one, because it's just kind of Chris Robinson, who, to be fair, clearly put a lot of work into this book. I assume he's the editor behind all of this. But he, or someone, was behind this, and he just talks about how like great it was to publish this book. So the book itself is very self-congratulatory to Marvel, and that last essay just kind of felt like an unnecessary final pat on the back in a book that already is patting itself pretty heavily on the back. But I do give them, like, the essays are interesting enough that I give it a pass by and large, except for the last one. And there are more essays than what's here. These are just the ones that are printed in the comic. There are more available online, and they are very interesting. That's what Tevi was saying in the chat as well. Raphael says, the law is different with superheroes in your reality. And I do understand that, so I'm trying not to read into it too much. It's just like a single page, like, cathartic moment, like I said, but it just felt a little iffy. And maybe just, even for a thing like this, a lot of the lessons or jokes coming out of the other 1 or 2 page stories felt a lot simpler, and their message felt a lot stronger, as opposed to that one where it's like, we don't need to be really going in that direction with She-Hulk. I just didn't feel. But I digress. It's a small part of a very large book, and even larger than what's actually printed in here. And I would probably recommend it. It is a fun read overall. Yeah, some bits of it are better than others. I do pretty seriously criticize the shorter stories in favor of the longer ones and the essays, which are more interesting. And I would have rathered more of the essays and longer stories, even if it meant a few less stories themselves. However, the good side of that is that you can incorporate these characters and these ideas into stories, like Raphael was saying, and make it more part of the mainstream Marvel, because there are cool ideas in this book. Goddess, the spider that became sentient over time, is one of those examples. A truly interesting character that is really just something different, an example of how, by showcasing just more talent in general, and, you know, plenty of people, like, in the majority of the U.S. population demographics worked on this book too. But by being collaborative like that and opening the door up for new talent as opposed to relying on the same old names for like 2 decades straight, we get these new and interesting ideas and stories that feel very fresh and invigorating compared to a lot of other traditional Big 2 books. So take of that what you will. But I think we'll leave it there. This was a fun review, and it was good to go through the book. I had a lot of fun chatting with Raphael and Tevya, who were pretty much with me the whole time, but I know there's a lot of other viewers quietly watching throughout. So thanks everyone for doing so, and we'll see you next time here on Comic Island.